Well, good afternoon, all you ALEC Freedom Patriots. I am happy to host a special policy hour this week. As you know, ALEC has introduced a new program, Policy Hours, every Friday at 2 o'clock. Having said that, we have a special one today because of a new report that our friend and partner Steve Moore and his colleague Casey Mulligan have put together. As we know, the new data from the U.S. Labor Bureau of Statistics has revealed the number of job openings across America has reached a staggering 9.3 million, a record number since the Bureau started reporting this information in the year 2000. And unfortunately, it's because of these continued expanded unemployment payments, such as the bonus $300 per week benefits authorized by the federal government and the American Rescue Plan Act, which encourages people not to work, which slows the economy and is really providing huge difficulties for the businesses we see all across the country. Even when small businesses increase their compensation, it's nearly impossible to compete with the federal government's printing presses. I'm glad to see that some states have addressed this problem and are leading the country to prove that there is safety in numbers. We saw a few months ago, Governor Gianforte from Montana was the first person to announce that he was going to end their state's participation in several of the federal programs created under the CARES Act. And right after him, South Carolina Governor Henry McMaster joined. And at this point, we now have 25 of the 27 states with Republican governors who have announced that they will stop giving expanded unemployment payments over the summer, many ending in June. Those two remaining Republican states are Massachusetts and Vermont. And unfortunately, I'm sad to report that none of the Democrat governors have seen fit to stop these unemployment payments. Last year, after the economic downturn, state unemployment insurance trust funds were under immense stress, as we all know. And I think you will hear from both Steve and from Casey Mulligan and our own Jonathan Williams that the important thing for governors to do at this point is to recognize that people want to get back to work and to stop these incentives. I really am pleased to see this report coming out of Steve and Casey Mulligan's shop, and want to turn the floor over to Steve Moore, who is our fearless leader, our co-author on Rich States, Poor States, and our governor's report. Steve, do you want to let us know about this report?
Sure. Thank you, Lisa. Great to be with everybody. Thanks. We love partnering up with ALEC on all of these state studies, and really was proud to partner up with Casey Mulligan, who you'll hear from in just a minute. He's at the University of Chicago, one of the top labor economists in the country. And our goal was to just look at what was happening with the unemployment insurance system. And not just, by the way, one of our major points, Lisa, is that the benefits are not just unemployment. There are at least 10 or 15 major cash assistance and in-kind benefit programs that are going to people who qualify for these programs. And that includes everything from food stamps to Obamacare subsidies to rental assistance and other kinds of, there are many others that I'm not even going to mention. But the point is that people say, well, unemployment insurance isn't all that high. It is high, but when you include all these other benefits, there's a real workness incentive. And so what we did in the study was just look at how much people can qualify for. We took as our base case a family of 4 with 2 unemployed parents and 2 kids. And then we looked at what was happening in the 50 states and how much people could get. And I thought I'd just show you the results of that very quickly and then turn it over to Casey, who's really the expert on this. So if you could you call up that one chart we have in the report? There's 2. We did the average benefit that you can get in each state and the maximum. And we're looking at here, by the way, the states. We're only concentrating on the states that have not suspended the $300 a week supplemental unemployment benefit. And so you can see these are the states that have not suspended those benefits. Now, this chart you're looking at right now is the maximum benefit. So what someone who gets the maximum amount of payment could earn with respect to earn is not the right word, to be sent from the government, we included 3 or 4 things. We included the normal unemployment benefit, We included the $300 supplement. We assumed there were 2 unemployed parents, so that's time 2. And then we included the $3,000 per child credit that parents are starting to receive already, which is not attached to work. And then we included the Obamacare subsidies, which are basically a free healthcare benefit to families. And there might have been 1 or 2 others that I've omitted, and Casey can correct me on that if I omitted anything. But what you're looking at is these numbers that both the annualized payments. By the way, these payments are not annualized; they're monthly. But we took over a 12-month period what would happen if people got them over the entire 12-month period. And you can see these numbers; they're very, very high. Well over $100,000 in 12 or so states. So if you're a representative of any of these states, you're providing real disincentive to work. And then you can see the hourly wage equivalent. And in most of these states, it's $20 or more, and in some cases up to $35 an hour. And then can you just quickly show that second chart? And while we're pulling that up, I should mention that if you want the full study, just go to our website, Committee to Unleash Prosperity, and you can pull down the whole report. But this is showing the average benefit. So we just took the maximum benefit, and the minimum benefit. We took the average of those per state, and you can see these are still very high benefits. And in most of these states, the hourly equivalent for the average benefit is above $15 an hour. We do believe this is a disincentive to work. And one last thing, and I'll turn it over to Casey. We had published a study back about 3 or 4 months ago when the Biden stimulus plan was passed, and we had predicted that there would be about 5 million fewer Americans working as a result of this. That is to say that the bill was not a stimulus bill of the economy; it was a de-stimulus bill because it was paying people not to work. And right now, I'd have to say, given where we are through the beginning of June, our estimates appear to be pretty much right on the mark. And I wish we were wrong. I mean, I'm not rooting against America. I wish that these disincentive effects didn't exist, but they do. And we are basically calling for Congress and the Biden administration to suspend the $300 a week unemployment benefits immediately. And if that doesn't happen, Lisa, we would like to see state legislatures and governors in these remaining 24 or 25 states to repeal these benefits, because they're having a very negative impact on the economies. And by the way, in the fairness of, it's not fair to the people who are working 40 hours a week, in many cases, to be making less money than people who are collecting government benefits. So with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Casey, who's the real expert on this.
Good morning, everybody. We're focused on this bonus policy, but we're taking kind of a holistic perspective. I mean, a bonus is what that says. It goes on top of a whole array of other benefits. So you could argue people don't want to live on $300 a week, which is what the bonus is right now. But that's a red herring. The states also provide unemployment cash to go with that $300. The federal government pays for your health insurance while you're unemployed. And if you join Obamacare, they'll put you on a low deductible plan. Now, we do recognize Obamacare is such a terrible program from the perspective of people don't want to spend their own money on it. This has been shown over and over again. So we don't count the whole taxpayer cost in that chart. In the table Steve showed you, it only accounts half of the taxpayer cost as a value to the unemployed. Because, like I said, people don't want to spend their own money on it, but it is worth something to have free health insurance, even if it is Obamacare. There's also a COBRA subsidy. You can stay on your former employer's plan, and the federal government, if you're unemployed, will pay the whole thing. So then on top of that, you have food stamps. They've been around for a long time, but the recent legislation expanded those too. And much of this stuff is tax-free for unemployed people. Now, we're not advocating that there be no safety net. We had a safety net for decades. We've had a safety net. There's been debate back and forth on kind of the right level to set it, but now we've just blown it to a whole new level, as you can see in the chart and the table that Steve showed you, the very large numbers on an annual basis or an hourly basis. that people are getting for not working. So this is a bonus, and we want to assess the magnitude. It's big. Steve showed you a couple of perspectives. You want to look at it on a weekly basis. It's $1,400 per week for an out of work family of four. And it's not an accident that, you know, some of the jobs out there that are tough, you know, grueling jobs, construction jobs, some of the manufacturing jobs, it's not an accident. People won't take those. You know, the employment rate in those industries actually fell a little in the last 2 months. Meanwhile, they added over 1 million job openings. So 1 million times they said, please come work for us. And what happened is actually more people quit than signed up. So this is, I guess we have to say that's a crisis situation. Now, there's been some studies that have been cited as finding little or no effect of the $300 on economic outcomes, such as the employment rate. First of all, that's not what their results show. I'm afraid you have to read the studies yourself and see with your own eyes. And many of them have results and even sentences very much like what Steve and I write. Like things like, oh, the groups of people for whom the bonus was the biggest percentage are the groups that employment went down the most and has stayed low the most. That's the same kind of things that Steve and I say, but then they have some technical reasons which are wrong, that they going to give the headline, oh, bonus has no effect. We looked at, if you could turn to, I believe it's page 9 on the bottom.
There it is. Yep.
Yeah, we could zoom in on the bottom. That's a chart of changes in job openings. So, you know, think of job openings as this, like a shelves in a store. You know, the trucks are coming in the back and loading in more job openings. You know, employers have tasks to be done. That's kind of loading up the shelves. And then customers, these would be potential workers, coming in and say, yeah, I'll take that job. And they're taking it out the front door. Well, what you had while the $600 bonus was on is that the shelves just kept piling up month after month, more and more job openings, and not enough people coming to take them. And then that miraculously, the first month that we took off the bonus, the CARES Act expired on that. Finally, the big stack of job openings started to decline, and you can see that in the August bar. And then we had several months where there wasn't much of a bonus. There was a little something there. My estimate, it's about $100 at that time. And then they turned the bonus back on again at a $300 rate. And then there it is. The first month, you have a very large accumulation of job openings. You don't have workers coming in and saying, I'll take those jobs. And if we were to update this chart for April, that April bar would be even bigger than the March bar. So we have job openings really piling up and not people coming in to take them, which would be a more normal and healthy economy. We also look at unemployment claims. Another claim that's been made is that unemployment claims are not related to the bonus, and that's not true. Unemployment claims were continuing claims were going up until they stopped the bonus, and then they finally started coming down, and they came down by millions. And then we turned the bonus back on again, stopped reduction in claims, and even today, very little reduction in continuing claims, which refers to the people who are, you know, continue to receive checks from the federal government on this program. So we welcome your questions and comments and perspectives from the states on this. Thank you.
Can I just add one thing, Lisa, to what Casey said? You know, when we did the original bonus benefits, that was back in, I don't know, March or so of last year. I don't remember the exact month, but that was when the economy was shut down, right? And so, you know, 20 or 25 million jobs immediately just disappeared. So, you know, obviously you had people thrown on assistance. And at that time, the government even said they wanted people to go back to work because of the COVID situation. And so even though I wasn't a big fan of those benefits a year ago, the COVID is over. There's just no rational reason today why those benefits would. I've never heard anybody make any rational explanation. Although I think, Casey, I think the White House is still saying that these are a stimulus to the economy.
Yeah, well, Yeah, I mean, these are the facts and the numbers speak for themselves. And as you walk through that data, Casey, I mean, it's just so obvious to anyone that this is what's going on. Jonathan Williams, I'm going to ask you to jump in, and I do see a couple of questions popping up on the screen. But Jonathan, I know that you have just worked with Tom Savage on our team on a blog in a response to this report. I wanted to ask you and invite you to jump in and comment if you would.
Well, thanks, Lisa, and Steve and Casey, really well done on the study. I really enjoyed it. And I think it's really an important piece of work for people to think through just these horrible disincentive effects that are being put out there at the federal level, and to just double down on what Lisa said, the leadership now that we're seeing at the state level, and this is the theme of the piece that Tom and I have on the ALEC website. You can see it now. I also have a version in the Hill, I believe, this coming week. Giving real credit where credit is due to Governor Greg Gianforte of Montana, and also Henry McMaster, Governor McMaster of South Carolina, for taking the lead. And now we've seen 25 in total follow their lead to say, let's get rid of this disincentive effect, because even in South Carolina, I believe Governor McMaster noted at the time, several weeks ago now, 80 or 90,000 unfilled positions in South Carolina alone. And of course, with the critical travel and tourism season just upon us in many of these states, especially up north, as Steve, as you know, as a Michigan native, there's only so many months a year you can go up to Lake Superior and enjoy yourself when it comes to the temperature and the weather. So, right, these small businesses, these NFIB type members across the country, need to make sure that they have a good summer, especially after last summer with the lockdown orders that were way over the top from some of these governors that we've talked about many times. But transitioning from this effect of the state bonus into what has happened at the state level when it comes to the state unemployment funds, as Casey correctly noted, it's not just federal unemployment benefits we're talking about here. We're talking about an average of roughly 350 or so a week at the state level, some far higher than that. I think Massachusetts is generally the highest in the $400 to $500 range per week. But those funds were pretty depleted, obviously, over this massive spike in unemployment claims last year around the COVID crisis, especially at the front side, where now Department of Labor found that 37 states have now fallen below the minimum level required to meet adequate solvency. So you have that situation going at the state level. You have the issue of massive fraud and improper payments that have happened. We've seen this in even some really popular news stories across the country in recent months of billions of dollars being diverted away from legitimate uses to international crime rings in some cases because of identity theft and problems there. So this has diverted resources away from people who actually needed it, obviously has depleted the funds even more. And let me make a quick comment on how this relates into the federal so-called stimulus bill signed into law in March by President Biden, the ARPA law. Maybe the silver lining to come out of this, and probably the least bad way of using the funds for you as state lawmakers out there, that you have the $350 billion or so in addition to the state and local level, through the ARPA program, is in the Treasury regs the guidance that just came out, they did give the green light to use money to replenish your state unemployment insurance trust funds to take care of this problem at the state level. And by the way, as Steve knows well, this is a huge issue for employers that have been on the ropes for months now. This will avoid an automatic tax increase that otherwise would have happened at the state level through the really problem with the balances in the unemployment insurance trust funds. So lots of really interesting effects at the state level as well. We are very concerned about some of these broad disincentive effects and very excited to see you highlight these so well in your study. And so with that, Lisa, I'll turn it back to questions. I know Lee's got some questions that he's put together after reading both pieces. And we're also starting to get quite a few questions I noticed in the chat box.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. A couple of things I'll just fill in here. So you mentioned the fraudulent payments. We've actually seen reports of up to $400 billion in fraudulent payments being paid out. So no small sum there, really a staggering number. I wonder if Steve or Casey can speak to that, any of the implications for federal or state budgets, but also kind of backing up to the number of unfilled jobs in our country. We've hit a staggering 9.3 million. And, Steve, have we ever seen this level of unfilled jobs in the US? I know I believe this is a record. Is that right? Since we've been tracking these figures since the year 2000, we've never seen this level of unfilled job openings.
Yeah, it's the highest ever. Now, look, we had a very high number at the end of 2019 under Trump because we had huge, job creation thanks to the deregulations and the lower taxes. And so, normal times having a surplus of jobs can be a good thing because it means you've got a vibrant economy and you've got businesses, hiring more workers, which is a positive thing. What's unique about this is that we still have, I forget the number, Casey, I think it's somewhere around 10 million Americans unemployed. And so it's clear what's happening now is just the unemployed aren't filling the jobs. And obviously you see this across the country where employers are trying to call back their workers and they're not coming back. One big explanation for that is because of the benefits. Now people will counter and say, well, if you're offered a job under unemployment insurance, if you have to take it or you lose your benefits. But I believe that they found ways to, Casey may know this better than me. I think one of the points that I meant to make, which is really important for the state legislators, is we've got to get back to work requirements, right? I mean, all of these programs should have work requirements. And we did this on a national level under Bill Clinton, a Democrat, where we had work requirements for programs. It worked very well. We got people back into the workforce and off of welfare. But Casey, you may understand these programs better than I do.
Well, it's a lot of money at stake. That's when you start out. Remember Obama, at the time, we were like, Obama, you're doing a bonus for unemployment. It was $25 a week. We did 600. So we at first we did 20x, more than 20x what Obama did. And then now we're just down to 10x. So there's a very large amount of money involved here. And that's part of the calculus for an employer thinking about whether he wants to anger his former employee and maybe a future employee by saying, throwing this federal cash out the window. So that feeds in, even if employers have the so-called right to call them back. This affects the economic calculus. It also affects the economic calculus for the international criminals sitting there across the ocean on their computers. The value to stealing an American's identity today is much higher because you can get all these goodies paid to you week after week after week. And the fraud occurs against working people. So this is, the working people are already exhausted because they can't get others to come in and help, at the office, at the store, at the factory. But then they also have to deal with the identity theft because Biden has put in this huge carrot out there for the identity thieves. And so workers are really suffering. And it would be nice if some of those remaining 26 governors would have some compassion for the workers.
And one other thing there too, and those are great points. I wanted to go back to one of I think the areas most affected by this, and that is the small business sector. So one of the things that we picked up on was the new NFIB Small Business Optimism Index, which of course they put out regularly. And while they note that while optimism has increased since January, a record in their survey of 48% of business owners reported job openings that could not be filled of the small businesses that NFIB surveyed. This is a record going back decades. And so we see the overall numbers of the 9.3 that we talked about, but essentially, I mean, I'd love to get your thoughts, Casey and Steve, on this. Is just how much this has the extra damaging impact on those mom and pop and the small businesses sector across the country.
There's no doubt about that. I mean, you really made a really important point, Jonathan, which is, the victims of this policy are clearly the small businesses, because I do think there was a part of this was deliberate, that a lot of my liberal friends, and I'm not being disparaging, they believed one way to increase wages in the United States was to essentially force small businesses to raise their wages by making the alternative, welfare more attractive. And so how do you make work more attractive? You raise your wages. And that actually for, a Home Depot or a Amazon or these Apple or the huge multi-trillion-dollar companies, they can to some extent absorb those costs. The problem is when you're talking about Joe's Hardware Store or, little businesses with 20 employees or restaurants. I mean, anybody look at a restaurant, anybody who's ever run a restaurant or owned a restaurant, I mean, those restaurants operate on razor thin margins. They don't have a lot of profits, especially coming out of this COVID, where in some places there's still restrictions on 100%, seating and things of that nature. So you're putting a real hardship. You're right, John. You're putting a real hardship on the small business employers. We have a business, a restaurant that's pretty popular in our village down the street from where I live, and it's the signs on the door says they're offering $18 an hour for kitchen help, which is a pretty good salary, $18 an hour, and that says free gym membership, free meals. We're going to provide IRAs, all of these benefits, to people, and it's like, and they still can't. I talked to the store owners; they still can't get some of these workers back. So that tells you how hard it is for small businesses to compete with their rich Uncle Sam.
And Steve and Casey, I know, for months you have been predicting this spot that we find ourselves in today. So I would ask you, take a look at your crystal ball again. We've got a pretty stark divide in the country. 25 states are decoupling from these expanded benefits, while others seem to be maintaining the new status quo. But where do you see this going from here? Do you see some states having much better economies as a result of decoupling and others continuing to have unfilled jobs?
Well, the good news about this, if there's any good news about this story, it is that the federal benefits are scheduled to expire around Labor Day. So that means we've got about 2 more months of these benefits. But that's 2 months, and why wait another day? I'm even mad at Lisa at some of our Republican governors that some of them are expiring these benefits until July. And I asked them, well, why wait? We know that the jobs are available. So that's the good news, that the benefits are going to expire in Labor Day. But the bad news is there are some states and some federal officials that are talking about extending these benefits. And there's even a proposal by Ron Wyden, who's the head of the Senate Finance Committee, to make the benefits permanent, if you can believe that. But Casey, do you have any thoughts about this?
A lot of what's happened has reminded me much what happened after 2008. And you go back and remember at that time, there was also not quite as generous as we have now, but the same sort of things, bonuses, unemployment insurance, more generous food stamps. And we were having this same conversation, where are the incentives to get back to work? And the Democrats ran all the branches and they just kept continuing it, and they continued it. The only thing that stopped it was, the Paul Ryan takeover of the House. And so I'm more pessimistic than Steve. I don't see these ending in September in the blue states. I see them ending after there's a turnover in Congress in 2022 when America gets to speak up again, because otherwise they don't have a great incentive to listen.
And one interesting point that was actually raised, it was submitted as a question for our speakers today. There's an interesting dynamic due to the lockdowns. Some parents are still dealing with having kids at home or struggling to find childcare, or schools maybe partially open. Is that having an effect on some workers headed back into the workforce?
There's no doubt that has an effect, and that's been studied. 2 things can have effects at the same time. We can't forget that. When you have thing A moving the economy, doesn't mean thing B is irrelevant. It means thing A and thing B add together. And we see this. So the employment rate for mothers with school-age children is artificially low right now, even below that for men, which is also artificially low because of the things we've been talking about. So that's an important factor. And also, it's unnecessary self-inflicted wound. There was no reason to have moms at home being teachers in their homes.
I wanted to add one other quick point that I forgot to mention, which is that a number of the Republican governors are proposing, or some I think have implemented these kind of bonus payments for going back to work. And this is just one man opinion. I haven't even talked to Casey about this or Lisa, but I'm not a huge fan of that policy. I mean, it's certainly much better than paying unemployment benefits for people remaining unemployed, but we have to think about just basic fairness. And the heroes of the economy, the people who've been working for the last 15 months, they're the people who really should be rewarded. And, I just have a little bit of a problem with providing a cash reward to somebody for going back to work and not rewarding the person who has been working, throughout the pandemic.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, Steve. We've thought about it a little bit internally here. I know we'll probably talk about it at the ALEC annual meeting as we have some of these in-depth discussions around our task forces with legislators. And so certainly invite everybody to come out and join us at the end of July in Salt Lake City, because we'll have a lot more of these in-depth conversations. Kind of an interesting point, because if I remember reading it correctly here, Governor Gianforte was one of the first that suggested that. And he actually had suggested to use some of the federal ARPA funds in order to pay those bonuses going out. And I suppose, yeah, I agree that probably needs some additional debate within the free market economist space. But at least I guess it's one of the least bad ways of using the federal money. At least you're not building up baseline spending, because that's what Casey made a point a minute ago that I thought was exactly right. We're seeing so many parallels to the 2008 financial crisis, and today when it comes to the government response, especially. And we fought this battle over the last year around why the federal government should not be bailing out state and local governments. We fought that battle back then. Unfortunately, we lost in both cases. However, this is just another kind of important point: is let's not set ourselves up for failure for the next decade when it comes to the spending battles at the state level by overextending ourselves, building up the baseline spending, and then having the maintenance of effort requirements that tie the hands of fiscally responsible legislators in the states. And so that's something, of course, we're keeping top of mind as well.
One other question for the panelists today, I think, is what advice would you give to state legislators who may be in a state that hasn't decoupled from these expanded benefits, but they're really pushing for it, but just because of the makeup of the legislature or who sits in the governor's mansion, they're struggling to do that? So,
the good news is, and those folks, I'm glad to hear that there are some blue state legislators on this call, and obviously you have special challenges, in those states if you've got a Democratic governor who wants to continue with the benefits. But look, the American public is with us on this. I mean, the polling is very clear. 70 to 80% of Americans do not favor, unemployment benefits that are keeping Americans favor a safety net. We're not arguing against the safety net. Americans just don't favor programs that are paying people more. They see the basic unfairness of this. So if you're a state senator or a state representative, you feel like it's hopeless, you've got your voters with you. I mean, keep agitating for this. Keep talking about it, because this is the last thing that these Democratic governors, the Democratic governors don't have an explanation for why they want to keep these benefits that's plausible. And I want to just punctuate a point that Casey made, because it's so important. And when he first told me about this, I didn't even believe it to be true. That when we provided supplemental unemployment benefits under Obama, they were $25 a week. What was that the number, Casey? 25? So we went from $25 a week to $600 a week, and now we're at $300 a week. Those are, $2,500 a week supplemental benefit I could certainly, maybe live with, but it is incredible how we just keep ratcheting up these numbers. And I worry, I do share Casey's worry, Lisa, that I do worry that these benefits, that there will be a movement to make these benefits permanent. I pray that doesn't happen, but I think there will be agitation to do that.
Well, it's possible that we could galvanize our legislators, in a way that would dispel that and kind of slow that effort down. If we start to see that, it would make a lot of sense. And you're right about the polling. I mean, everything that we've seen has shown that people want to get back to work. I did hear some kind of a pivot the other day of in the news here in the Beltway around, this is such good news that there's so many jobs that that are
Mhm.
opening, because that means that all the high school kids, because of the timing of the unemployment benefits ending in September, that all the high school kids and college kids can come back and work in these temporary jobs for the summer. So I don't know if that's something that you've seen and you have a response to, or kind of how to juxtapose that. But I thought it was an interesting kind of pivot.
It was a
away
good,
from
Lisa,
filling
there was
jobs.
a really good, interesting, I would refer people, I think it was yesterday's front page of the Wall Street Journal had a piece about high school and college kids. And they're making huge amounts of money this summer because they're the only ones who are going, and they're not eligible for unemployment benefits. So they had one kid who was making like, several $100,000 because he had all these jobs that he was doing. So that's the maybe the savior of the economy. But then what happens in late
Big
August?
bummer when they graduate and they can't get a job.
Yeah.
A whole new generation of young entrepreneurs are taking this market and then using it. It's great to see. But one question I had, because reading the Wall Street Journal editorial, the lead editorial today, and I'd love to get both of your thoughts on this as it relates to pumping more money seems like every week we have another $1 trillion spending proposal. And if Senator Wyden and others talk about doing this permanently, that's a whole lot more government support going into the economy right now, as we've seen core inflation rise dramatically recently. And they point out a couple of really interesting things, is that money supply is up 31% since the end of 2019, and federal spending is 50% higher. So how worried are both of you about kind of additional government resources getting pumped into the economy and that effect on inflation?
Well, my view is, maybe Casey, I can ask Casey as well, but I think the worst possible thing we could do right now is pass another. We should be cutting government spending now, not increasing government spending. We didn't need the $1.9 trillion that was, you mentioned that, these states now have surpluses, and we need to do a report, by the way, at ALEC about the absurd things that some of these states are spending this money on, because it's just free money coming in from Washington. And, California, so many of these states have money. I saw that North Carolina is spending money on NASCAR and things like that. So, my attitude is we don't need any more spending. And we did a little study at the Committee to Unleash Prosperity. We just looked at the $1.9 trillion spending bill that passed back in March. And if they want to spend more money on roads and bridges, all they have to do is just take the money. Let's get rid of the $300 a week benefit, and let's get rid of some of the state money to the states and reassign it, reprogram it to fixing roads and bridges. In other words, we don't need additional spending. We just need to spend the money we've got, wisely. Shelley Moore Capita, I don't know if she was ever a ALEC member, but she has the right line on this. If we're going to spend more money on this, there's money in the system to do it. We don't have this idea of continuing to pour more money is clearly, Jonathan, you're spot on. It is clearly going to fan the flames of inflation, and that's a tax on low-income people. But I don't know, Casey, if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I do know that regular people hate inflation a lot more than we economists do. So let me advertise my own bias there. But the empirical connection between the size of government and inflation is pretty weak. So I like to focus, like Steve said, on the things, all the problems with the direct problems with it, like trying to make all the cars electric. That's got so many problems with it. Inflation is like really low on the list from with my bias, and the same with these unemployment benefits. I mean, the real problem is, we can't provide goods and services very well when people aren't working, and the unfairness associated with it. Subsidizing layoffs, that's the other side of the unfairness, that those who laid off their workers are looking like heroes now because of the money that rained down on the people from that. So I think we should focus on the real demerits of Biden's plans from a micro perspective.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Question to Jonathan, if I could, because I wanted to make sure I understood what you were saying, Jonathan, about the unemployment benefits and the trust funds, because it's a big issue for states. Traditionally, when states run unemployment insurance deficits in their trust funds, they have to raise the revenues to, to replenish the money. And the way that people don't, this is one of the most complicated programs in the history of this. I've spent years studying this program. I still don't completely understand how it works because there's so many components with it, but it's paid for by a tax on employers. It's essentially like a payroll tax. And were you saying that the states are not going to have to pay back that money in their trust funds? In other words, how are these trust funds going to be replenished?
Well, it's a really important point. I'm glad you raised it again here, Steve, because we have some upcoming research on this that we'll be putting out at ALEC. We'll have at our annual meeting, and we'll discuss this quite in depth. We have our state treasurer is going to be joining us from the State Financial Officers Foundation with their annual meeting coinciding with ours. And so I know many of them are looking into this as well. But it's such an essential point because maybe, as I mentioned, I think briefly, the silver lining of the Treasury guidance that came out after ARPA was signed into law by President Biden was that states could use some of the federal funds to replenish those unemployment insurance trust funds at the state level. And it has the effect of avoiding, really building up baseline budgets and baseline spending that will come back to haunt fiscal conservatives in the years ahead. But it has the second and probably more immediate impact of avoiding these massive tax increases on employers as they try to bring more people back on the payroll. And we have several examples that we've written about where North Carolina is really a shining example of how they fixed their system, had it replenished, and have avoided tax increases for many years under now Senator Tillis, then Speaker Tillis, who was on the ALEC Board of Directors, did through their big tax reform process. But other states are a mess. I mean, as I've talked about, 37 states don't meet the minimum criteria to be adequate. So you have to borrow from the feds, and they have to raise taxes on employers. And neither one of those things are great exercises that states should be doing if they want to be fiscally responsible states. Such an important point that I think, look at the polling, you look at the economics, and across the board, Americans do not want to see higher taxes on employers and on small businesses right now that have barely made it through COVID. This is the last time to be raising taxes. And thank goodness, at least that allowable piece of the federal funds can be used to replenish those trust funds at the state level. So I guess one final point is that we had a couple of questions. I know Delegate Krebs from Maryland had a question that we addressed a little bit on childcare. And before we get to final thoughts here, maybe on a final round robin, kind of a softball question for you guys because you deal with this all the time, but one that I hear coming from, let's say, Elizabeth Warren in the US Senate and others to say, well, why don't we just pay people more? If you're worried about people having the disincentive to go back to the workplace with the higher unemployment benefits, why don't we just, have a higher minimum wage or a higher living wage, and that'll solve all of our problems. And so this comes up, of course, at lots of conversations. Maybe you're talking to your liberal aunt or uncle and this comes up. How do you guys respond to that?
Well, let me take a first swing at this. We have a program, one of the few, welfare programs, income assistance programs that I generally support is called the Earned Income Tax Credit. And the way that works is basically a supplement to a person's salary, to make sure they have if you're working 40 hours a week, that you're not in poverty. And I've always supported that plan because we're in a rich country and people who are working 40 hours a week should have an income that they can support their family with. And that forces that puts the cost of that on the back of the taxpayers, not the individual businesses. Because if you put it on the back of the individual businesses, you're gonna put them in incredible financial stress. And so people forget we have that program in place already. And when people throw around all these statistics about the minimum wage and this and that, they don't take into account the earned income credit. And in fact, if I had my way, I would make the earned income credit more generous and I get rid of all the other programs because it's a work required program. But I would only reiterate what I said before, Jonathan. Yeah, that might work. That strategy might work, when you're talking about the Apples and Amazons. But when you're talking about small businesses, with 5 or 6 employees that have small margins, you're going to put them right out of business. Casey?
Well, the key to wages is productivity, like Steve said. Why do some people have low wages? It's their productivity, and what can be done about that. And I believe in the old saying, when I was in government, I said it and they didn't like it, but should take the log out of your own eye. And that government can do that. Government does all kinds of things to reduce the productivity, especially of low skilled people. Many in the regulatory area. We could take, I mentioned earlier, making all the cars electric. This is a recipe for making auto workers less productive and everyone in the auto supply chain less productive in terms of delivering value to consumers. Consumers don't want electric cars. And you can go on and on and on, as President Trump did with so many regulations he changed. And it wasn't an accident that we saw blue collar wages growing when we removed so many of these unnecessary regulations. And I know the people at ALEC, better than me. You should probably be telling me all the things that states can do, because states are full of regulations too. So that, I think, go to productivity, go to the root cause, and you'll be disappointed by the Band-Aids.
Well, thanks, Casey and Steve, Jonathan and Lisa. I want to do a quick round of final thoughts here before we wrap up. Jonathan, we'll start with you, but before we do, I'll just say the great report that Steve and Casey have been discussing over the past 45 minutes, it's at committee-to-unleash-prosperity.com. I'm going to drop a link to that here in the chat box. And I've also included a link to our recent ALEC article from Jonathan and our colleague Tom Savage. So Jonathan, we'll start with you for any closing thoughts.
Well, thank you, Lee, and thanks for everybody for joining us on a Friday here. I hope you found this conversation as really informational as I did, informative. And thanks to Casey and Steve for your great new study. I think that's going to be really important to highlight the disincentive effects of so many of these federal programs that we've talked about. And just kind of some final thoughts based on synthesizing our discussion reminds me, Steve, of a quote from our co-author Arthur Laffer in Rich States, Poor States, that when you tax people who work and you pay people who don't work, we really shouldn't be surprised when we have fewer people working, right? And so that's essentially Economics 101 lesson of what your paper is, we've been talking about today. And I think the proof is really in the pudding of what your point on disincentive effects. There was a study done recently by the Foundation for Government Accountability that showed of the first 22 states that ended and decoupled from the federal bonus payments, or at least announced they did, they immediately increased job applications by 5%. So really real world effects to what we've been talking about today. But a couple of the other points I know we have as takeaways for our ALEC legislators and our annual meeting coming up and some of our other work ahead is certainly digging into this fraud issue, the improper payments, the audits that probably need to be done or are starting to be done in some cases. And then also, looking at the transparency of the massive amount of federal funds that are going into states, and not only states, by the way, but maybe the bigger issue is the lack of transparency and accountability as the federal funds flow to the local units of government directly and to school districts directly without state accountability or transparency or oversight. And so we are going to roll up our sleeves here at ALEC. There's a lot of work to do ahead. There's no such thing as a free lunch coming from the federal government to the states. Lots of bad disincentive effects, bad effects in terms of overspending at the state level. We're absolutely incentivizing states to spend more than they would otherwise, even in record revenue situations for many state and local governments right now. So thanks to Steve and Casey. We look forward to continuing our work together. And thanks to all of you as legislators and private sector members for joining us today.
Casey, we'll go to you next for any closing thoughts.
I just look forward to hearing from you guys and your members. I mean, you're on the ground near the real economy and how it's working. So this kind of partnership and conversation I really appreciate it and hope we can continue that. And
Steve, you can wrap us up here.
Well, ditto to what Casey said. Casey and I are at your all disposal if you need to have more information or if we can help in your state. This is a big issue. It's going to continue to brew. We now have 9.3 million job openings. The case for getting America back to work is as strong as ever. And thanks. We just love working with ALEC and looking forward to seeing everybody in Salt Lake, right? Not too long. When is that? In about a month?
That's right. We'll be in Salt Lake City for the ALEC annual meeting, July 28th through 30th, and hope to see everyone there. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to join us on this Friday morning. And that wraps up our special ALEC Policy Hour. Hope that everyone has a great weekend.